crack of musket fire echoed through the Pennsylvania wilderness as Private Thomas Hartwell pressed his back against the rough bark of an ancient oak. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, mixing with the grime and gunpowder that had become his constant companion since joining the Virginia Regiment 6 months prior. It was the 9th of July, 1755, and the world as he knew it was collapsing around Fort Duquesne. "Stay down, lad," bellowed Sergeant Macready, his Scottish accent thick with urgency. The seasoned veteran crawled through the underbrush, his red coat torn and stained with mud. "The French have us surrounded, and their Indian allies know these woods better than we know our own mothers' faces." Thomas clutched his brown Bess musket, its stock slick with perspiration. He had enlisted in the colonial militia with dreams of glory and adventure, inspired by tales of brave soldiers defending the frontier. The reality of warfare in the American wilderness was far different from the romanticized stories he had heard. In the taverns of Williamsburg, the morning had begun with such promise. General Edward Braddock's expedition had marched with confidence toward the French stronghold, their redcoats gleaming in the summer sun. The British regulars maintained perfect formation, their discipline, a source of pride for the Empire. Thomas had felt invincible marching alongside 1,200 men, their bayonets catching the light as they advanced through the forest. But the French and their Native American allies had other plans. They struck like ghosts from the shadows, using the very landscape against the British forces. The neat formations that worked so well on European battlefields became death traps in the dense American forest. Men fell like wheat before the scythe, their cries lost in the cacophony of battle. According to historical accounts documented by the Pennsylvania Gazette, the ambush at the Monongahela River would later be recognized as one of the most devastating defeats in British military history during the colonial period. Thomas watched in horror as General Braddock fell from his horse. Mortally wounded by enemy fire, the general's aide-de-camp, a young Virginia colonel named George Washington, rallied the remaining troops, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. Despite having 2 horses shot from under him, Washington continued to organize the retreat, his leadership preventing complete annihilation. The forest seemed alive with danger. Every shadow could conceal an enemy warrior. Every rustle of leaves might herald another volley of musket fire. Thomas had learned to move like a hunter rather than a soldier, abandoning the rigid formations drilled into him during training. Survival demanded adaptation. Those who refused to learn the ways of frontier warfare rarely lived to see another sunrise. As the surviving British forces began their desperate retreat, Thomas reflected on the harsh lessons of his first major engagement. The French and Indian War was unlike any conflict the British had faced before. It was a struggle for survival in an unforgiving wilderness, where traditional European military tactics meant little against enemies who fought with cunning and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The boy who had marched confidently toward Fort Duquesne that morning was gone forever, replaced by a man who understood that war was not about glory or honor, but about staying alive long enough to see home again. The real education of Private Thomas Hartwell was just beginning. The remnants of Braddock's army stumbled through the Pennsylvania wilderness like wounded animals seeking shelter. Thomas Hartwell's feet were raw and bleeding inside his leather boots, each step a reminder of the devastating defeat at the Monongahela. 3 days had passed since the ambush, and the survivors were still fleeing eastward. Haunted by the memory of their fallen comrades, Colonel Washington had assumed command of the Virginia Regiment after Braddock's death, his youthful face bearing the weight of responsibility beyond his 23 years. Thomas admired the way the young officer maintained discipline among the demoralized troops, never allowing despair to take root despite the overwhelming circumstances they faced. The wounded were the worst burden to bear. Without proper medical supplies, many men suffered from infected wounds that festered in the humid summer heat. Thomas helped carry Corporal Jenkins, whose leg had been shattered by a musket ball. The man's fevered rambling about his wife and children in Maryland served as a constant reminder of what they had all left behind. "We'll make camp here," Washington announced as they reached a clearing beside a small stream. The water was a blessing, clear and cool against their parched throats. Thomas watched as the colonel moved among his men, checking on the wounded and offering words of encouragement. It was leadership forged in the crucible of defeat. And Thomas recognized something special in this young Virginian. The evening brought little comfort. They dared not light large fires for fear of attracting French patrols or hostile war parties. Thomas sat beside the dying embers of a small cooking fire, sharing hardtack and salt pork with his messmates. The food was barely edible, but it was sustenance, and they had learned not to take such things for granted. Sergeant Macready approached their small group. His weathered face grave in the flickering light.
"Listen well, lads,"
he said, settling. Beside them, what we learned at the Monongahela will serve us if we're smart enough to heed it. The French fight different than we do. They use the forest like a weapon, and their Indian allies know every tree and stream from here to the Great Lakes. Thomas nodded, remembering the terror of facing an enemy he could barely see. The French had adapted to American warfare, learning from their Native American allies to fight from cover and use mobility to their advantage. The British, with their rigid formations and bright red coats, had been easy targets in the dense forest. The French commander at Fort Duquesne, Captain Beaujeu, he knew we were coming, Macready continued. They prepared an ambush that turned our strength against us. Our numbers meant nothing when we couldn't see who we were fighting. As referenced in military correspondence preserved in the colonial records of Pennsylvania, the French forces at Fort Duquesne had indeed been well prepared for Braddock's advance, utilizing intelligence networks and Native American scouts to track British movements. The night sounds of the forest took on a sinister quality as Thomas tried to sleep. Every owl's hoot might be a signal between enemy scouts. Every snapping twig could herald an attack. He had learned to sleep with his musket loaded and ready, one hand always on the stock. The carefree young man who had enlisted months earlier seemed like a stranger now. Dawn brought new challenges. Several of the wounded had died during the night, their bodies wrapped in blankets and left behind with simple wooden crosses to mark their graves. Thomas helped dig the shallow graves, each shovel of earth a reminder of their mortality. War was not just about the glory of battle. It was about the constant presence of death and the weight of survival. The march continued eastward, each mile taking them further from the French stronghold, but closer to an uncertain future. Thomas wondered what awaited them at Fort Cumberland. Their destination? Would they be blamed for the defeat? Would they be given time to heal and regroup? Or would they be thrown into another impossible situation? As they walked, Thomas reflected on the lessons learned in blood and defeat. The French and Indian War was reshaping not just the political landscape of North America, but the very nature of warfare itself. The old ways of fighting were giving way to new tactics born of necessity and adaptation. The wooden palisades of Fort Cumberland rose before them like salvation itself, but Thomas Hartwell knew better than to feel relief. It was late September 1755, and the approaching winter promised hardships that might prove deadlier than French muskets. The fort, hastily constructed on a hill overlooking the Potomac River, would be their home for the coming months. Inside the fort's walls, conditions were deplorable. Over 300 men were crammed into barracks designed for half that number. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke from inadequate fireplaces, and the ever-present odor of disease. Thomas had witnessed more men die from camp fever and dysentery than from enemy bullets, a harsh reality that no amount of military training could prepare a soldier for. Colonel Washington had transformed since the disaster at the Monongahela. The young officer drove himself relentlessly, working to rebuild the Virginia regiment while dealing with supply shortages, desertion, and the constant threat of French and Indian raids along the frontier. Thomas often saw him writing dispatches. By candlelight, his correspondence with Governor Dinwiddie, growing increasingly frustrated as promises of reinforcements and supplies went unfulfilled. Another patrol failed to return, reported Captain Stewart during the morning assembly. 3 men had been sent to scout the approaches to the fort 2 days earlier and had simply vanished into the wilderness. It was becoming a common occurrence, and Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The daily routine at Fort Cumberland was a mixture of drill, guard duty, and the constant struggle to maintain equipment and morale. Thomas had been assigned to the morning wood detail, a dangerous task that required venturing outside the fort's protective walls. Every tree they cut might be their last, every moment in the forest a gamble with death. Sergeant Macready had adapted to frontier warfare better than most of the British regulars. He taught the men to move quietly through the underbrush, to read the signs of the forest, and to fight from cover like their enemies. "Forget everything you learned about standing in neat lines," he would say. "Out here, the man who hides best lives longest." The food situation grew worse as autumn progressed. Salt pork had become a luxury, and the men survived on a diet of hardtack, cornmeal, and whatever game they could hunt near the fort. Thomas had learned to supplement his rations with wild berries and edible roots, knowledge passed down from more experienced frontiersmen. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at their strength and resolve, according to documentation found in the Virginia military records. Supply shortages plagued colonial forces throughout the early years of the French and Indian War, with many frontier posts operating on minimal provisions for months at a time. Disease struck with ruthless efficiency in the overcrowded conditions. Thomas watched helplessly as men he had marched with succumbed to fever, their bodies burning with heat, while they shivered uncontrollably. The fort surgeon, Dr. Craik, did what he could with limited medical supplies. But too often his efforts were futile against the ravages of camp diseases. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical hardships. Men who had enlisted with dreams of adventure found themselves trapped in a nightmare of constant vigilance and grinding misery. Desertion became commonplace, with soldiers simply walking away from their posts under cover of darkness, preferring to take their chances in the wilderness rather than endure another day of military life. Thomas found solace in writing letters to his family in Virginia, though he knew better than to describe the true conditions at Fort Cumberland. Instead, he wrote of his fellow soldiers' courage and his own determination to serve his colony faithfully. The act of writing helped him remember who he had been before the war. When life held promise beyond mere survival, the arrival of winter brought new challenges. Snow began falling in November, and the temperature dropped steadily. The barracks were poorly heated, and men huddled together for warmth during the long nights. Firewood became precious, and the wood details grew more dangerous as they were. Forced to venture further from the fort's walls, Thomas had learned to appreciate small comforts: a warm meal, a dry place to sleep, the camaraderie of his messmates. These simple pleasures took on profound meaning in the context of constant hardship. He understood now that war was not just about dramatic battles and heroic charges, but about the daily struggle to maintain humanity in inhuman conditions. Fort's chapel, little more than a rough wooden structure, became a refuge for many soldiers. Thomas attended services regularly, finding peace in the familiar words of Scripture and the shared faith of his fellow soldiers. Prayer had become more than ritual. It was a lifeline to hope in the midst of despair. Spring arrived at Fort Cumberland with the promise of renewed campaign activity, but Thomas Hartwell had learned not to trust promises. It was April 1756, and Colonel Washington was preparing for another attempt against the French strongholds in the Ohio Valley. The young officer had spent the winter months transforming the Virginia regiment into a more effective fighting force, adapting European military traditions to the realities of frontier warfare. Thomas had been promoted to corporal after showing exceptional courage during a recent skirmish with French raiders. The promotion came with additional responsibilities he had never imagined when he first enlisted. Now he was responsible for the lives of 8 men in his squad, a burden that weighed heavily on his shoulders as he prepared them for the coming campaign. The morning drill had evolved significantly since their arrival at Fort Cumberland. Instead of the rigid formations favored by British regulars, Washington had implemented training that emphasized individual marksmanship, woodland tactics, and the ability to fight from cover. Thomas watched his men practice these new techniques, noting how much more confident they appeared when using methods suited to their environment. "Remember what we learned at the Monongahela?" Thomas instructed his squad during weapons training. "French and their Indian allies use the forest against us. We must learn to use it for ourselves." He demonstrated the proper way to load and fire from behind a tree. techniques that would have been considered cowardly by European standards but were essential for survival in the American wilderness. The supply situation had improved somewhat with the arrival of spring, but shortages remained a constant concern. Thomas had learned to be resourceful, trading with friendly Indian tribes for food and ammunition when possible. These interactions taught him that not all Native Americans were enemies. Many were simply trying to survive in a world torn apart by the imperial ambitions of European powers. News arrived that General John Forbes was preparing a new expedition against Fort Duquesne, this time with a larger force and better preparation. Thomas felt a mixture of anticipation and dread at the prospect of returning to the scene of their previous defeat. The memories of that terrible day remained vivid, but he also understood that redemption lay in facing those demons rather than running from them. Colonel Washington had grown into his command responsibilities, displaying the leadership qualities that would later make him famous. Thomas observed how the young officer balanced discipline with compassion, maintaining military efficiency while caring for his men's welfare. It was a lesson in leadership that would serve Thomas well in his own developing role. As a non-commissioned officer, the fort's routine was disrupted by the arrival of refugees from frontier settlements. Families fled westward as French and Indian raiding parties struck isolated farms and villages. Thomas helped organize the defense of these civilians, setting up temporary shelters within the fort's walls and coordinating patrols to protect the surrounding area, as documented in the Pennsylvania colonial records. The frontier warfare characteristic of this period involved numerous small-scale actions rather than large set-piece battles. With civilian populations bearing much of the conflict's burden, one particularly harrowing incident occurred when a family of settlers arrived at the fort. After their homestead was attacked, the father had been killed defending his property, and the mother and 3 children had fled through the forest with only the clothes on their backs. Thomas helped tend to their wounds and listen to their story, gaining a deeper understanding of what the war meant to ordinary people trying to build new lives in America. The psychological toll of constant vigilance was becoming apparent among the garrison. Men who had seemed steady and reliable began showing signs of strain, jumping at unexpected sounds and displaying the hollow-eyed look of those who had seen too much violence. Thomas recognized these symptoms in himself and worked to maintain his men's morale through shared hardships and small acts of kindness. Training became more intensive as the Forbes expedition approached. Thomas drilled his squad in forest fighting techniques, teaching them to move silently through underbrush and to communicate through hand signals. These skills had been learned through bitter experience, and he was determined that his men would not suffer the same losses that had devastated Braddock's army. The arrival of regular British troops created tension within the fort. The newly arrived soldiers looked down on the colonial militia, considering them inferior to properly trained European troops. Thomas had to prevent several fights between his men and the regulars, understanding that such divisions could prove fatal in combat as summer approached. Thomas reflected on his transformation from naive recruit to seasoned non-commissioned officer. The war had stripped away his illusions about military glory, replacing them with a hard-earned understanding of leadership, sacrifice, and the true cost of conflict. He was no longer the boy who had enlisted with dreams of adventure. He was a man shaped by the crucible of war, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning of September 14th, 1758 dawned crisp and clear as Thomas Hartwell adjusted his equipment one final time. General Forbes's expedition was finally moving against Fort Duquesne, and this time the approach would be different. Instead of following Braddock's route, it would cut a new road through the Pennsylvania wilderness, a slower but more secure advance that would establish permanent supply lines and communication. Thomas looked down at his corporal's stripes with a mixture of pride and apprehension. His squad of 8 men had become his family over the past months, and he felt responsible for bringing each one home alive. Private Morrison, barely 18 years old, reminded him of himself when he first enlisted. Sergeant McCready, now graying at the temples, had become a father figure to the entire company. The column stretched for miles through the forest, a vast improvement over Braddock's expedition. Forbes had learned from previous mistakes incorporating colonial rangers and friendly Indian scouts into his force. The contrast with their earlier disaster was striking. This time, they moved with purpose and preparation rather than blind confidence. Colonel Washington rode past Thomas's position, his bearing confident but cautious. The young Virginian had argued for following Braddock's route, but Forbes had overruled him, choosing the longer but safer Pennsylvania approach. Thomas respected both officers, but trusted Washington's frontier experience more than Forbes's European training. The road-building process was back-breaking work. Thomas's men took turns with axes and shovels, clearing trees and leveling ground. For the Army's passage, every mile was purchased with sweat and determination, but each mile also represented progress toward their objective. The men sang work songs to maintain their rhythm, their voices echoing through the forest. Food had improved significantly since their early days at Fort Cumberland. The new supply system ensured regular deliveries of salt, pork, hardtack, and rum, though the quality remained questionable. Thomas had learned to supplement their rations with wild game when possible, and his men had become skilled hunters and foragers during their time in the wilderness. Intelligence reports suggested that the French garrison at Fort Duquesne had been weakened by the broader war effort. French forces were being pulled back to defend more strategic positions, leaving their frontier outposts vulnerable. Thomas hoped these reports were accurate, but he had learned not to trust intelligence completely after the disaster at the Monongahela. Expedition's composition reflected lessons learned from previous campaigns. Instead of relying solely on European-trained regular troops, Forbes had incorporated colonial militia, rangers, and friendly Indian allies who understood frontier warfare. This diversity of military styles created some friction, but it also provided tactical flexibility that had been lacking in earlier campaigns. As documented in General Forbes's correspondence with British military authorities, the expedition represented a new approach to warfare in the American colonies, emphasizing preparation and adaptation over rapid movement and traditional tactics. Thomas's squad had been assigned to the advance guard, coited position that required constant vigilance, but also offered the best chance to engage the enemy. They moved through the forest with practiced stealth, their movements coordinated through years of shared experience. Each man knew his role and trusted his comrades to fulfill theirs. The weather began to turn as October approached, bringing cold rain that turned the forest floor into a muddy quagmire. Thomas's men maintained their equipment carefully, knowing that a misfiring musket could mean death in combat. They had learned to keep their powder dry and their weapons clean despite the challenging conditions. Disease remained a constant threat. Even with improved supplies and medical care, Thomas had learned to recognize the early signs of camp fever and dysentery, isolating sick men when possible to prevent the spread of illness. The expedition surgeon, Dr. Lettsam, had proven more competent than his predecessor, but medical knowledge remained limited in dealing with the diseases that plagued military campaigns. The psychological preparation was perhaps as important as the physical training. Thomas spoke with his men about what they might face at Fort Duquesne, helping them process their fears and anxieties. Many remembered the stories of Braddock's defeat, and Thomas worked to rebuild their confidence through realistic training and honest communication about the challenges ahead. Scouting reports indicated that French patrols had been encountered ahead of the main column, suggesting that the enemy was aware of their approach. Thomas felt the familiar tension that preceded combat, a mixture of fear and excitement that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. He checked his musket one more time and said a silent prayer for his men's safety. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as the expedition approached its destination. Thomas could sense the weight of history in the making, understanding that this campaign would determine the future of the frontier. Whether they succeeded or failed, the outcome would be remembered long after the last shot was fired, as they prepared for what might be their final approach to Fort Duquesne. Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From naive recruit to seasoned, non-commissioned officer, he had been transformed by the crucible of war into a leader of men, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in the service of his colony and his comrades. The acrid smell of burning wood reached Thomas Hartwell's nostrils before he saw the smoke rising above the tree line. It was November 24th, 1758, and General Forbes's expedition had finally reached their destination, only to discover that Fort Duquesne was ablaze. The French garrison, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, destroyed their stronghold rather than allow it to fall into British hands. Thomas advanced with his squad through the smoldering ruins, his musket ready despite the apparent absence of enemy forces. The sight that greeted them was both victory and anticlimax. The massive earthworks and wooden fortifications that had dominated the Ohio Valley for years lay in ruins, their blackened timbers still smoking in the cold autumn air. Spread out and search for survivors, Thomas ordered his men, though he doubted they would find any. The French commander had executed a masterful withdrawal, denying the British the satisfaction of a dramatic conquest while preserving his forces for future operations. It was a reminder that, even in victory, war rarely unfolded according to plan. Sergeant Macready approached with a grim expression, his weathered face reflecting the mixed emotions they all felt. 3 years of planning and preparation, and they deny us a proper fight, he muttered, kicking at a charred timber. Still, the objective is secured, and that's what matters to the generals. The ruins told the story of the French occupation. Thomas examined the remains of the barracks, the magazine, and the trading post that had made Fort Duquesne a center of French influence in the region. The fort had been larger and more sophisticated than he had imagined, explaining why it had taken so long to mount a successful campaign against it. Colonel Washington supervised the occupation of the site, his expression revealing little of his thoughts. The young officer had argued for a more direct approach to the campaign, but Forbes's methodical advance had ultimately proven successful. Thomas admired Washington's professionalism in accepting the outcome, even when it differed from his preferred strategy. The discovery of several fresh graves outside the fort's walls provided evidence of the garrison's recent presence. Thomas's men investigated carefully, finding signs that the French had maintained a force of several hundred men until very recently. The timing of their withdrawal suggested that they had waited until the last possible moment before abandoning their position. Intelligence gathered from captured documents revealed the broader strategic situation. The French were consolidating their forces around their remaining strongholds, preparing for a final defense of New France. The loss of Fort Duquesne represented a significant blow to their position, but the war was far from over. As referenced in military dispatches preserved in the British National Archives, the capture of Fort Duquesne marked a turning point in the French and Indian War, opening the Ohio Valley to British expansion and cutting crucial supply lines too. French forces in the Great Lakes region, Thomas helped establish a temporary camp among the ruins, while engineers began planning the construction of a new British fort on the site. The position's strategic importance was obvious, controlling the junction of 3 major rivers and serving as a gateway to the western frontier. The new fort would be named Fort Pitt in honor of the British Secretary of State. The expedition's success had come at a considerable cost in men and resources. Thomas reflected on the comrades who had died during the long campaign, their graves scattered along the road from Fort Cumberland to this remote wilderness outpost. Victory always carried a price, and the survivors bore the responsibility of making their sacrifices meaningful. The arrival of winter weather added urgency to the construction efforts. Thomas's men worked alongside engineers and artisans to build temporary shelters and begin the foundations of the new fort. The work was hard but purposeful, each day bringing them closer to establishing a permanent British presence in the Ohio Valley. Relations with local Indian tribes required careful management. Some had been allied with the French and viewed the British victory with suspicion, while others saw opportunities for new trading relationships. Thomas observed these negotiations with interest, understanding that the future of the frontier depended as much on diplomacy as on military force. The psychological impact of the campaign's success was significant for the men who had survived Braddock's defeat. Thomas felt a sense of redemption in returning to the scene of their earlier disaster, even if the victory had been less dramatic than hoped. The ghosts of the Monongahela had been laid to rest through perseverance and professional competence. Supply lines remained a constant concern despite the campaign's success. The road built by Forbes's expedition required constant maintenance and protection from French and Indian raids. Thomas understood that holding the Ohio Valley would require the same determination that had been needed to capture it. As December approached, Thomas received word that his term of enlistment would expire soon. The decision to re-enlist or return to civilian life weighed heavily on his mind. The war had changed him profoundly, and he wondered whether he could ever truly return to the peaceful life he had known before taking up arms. The construction of Fort Pitt progressed rapidly under the supervision of skilled engineers. Thomas contributed his experience with frontier conditions, helping design defenses that would be effective against both European-style sieges and Indian raids. The new fort represented not just military necessity, but also the expansion of British civilization into the wilderness. The morning of March 15th, 1759 brought news that would change everything for Thomas Hartwell. A messenger arrived at Fort Pitt with dispatches from Williamsburg, including orders for the partial reduction of the Virginia Regiment. After nearly 4 years of service, Thomas was being offered the choice between re-enlistment and honorable discharge. The decision he faced would define the rest of his life. Thomas stood atop the newly completed walls of Fort Pitt, looking out over the 3 rivers that had drawn European powers to this remote corner of the wilderness. The Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela converged below him, their waters carrying the hopes and dreams of thousands of settlers who would soon follow the Army's path westward. The fort he had helped build would serve as a gateway to the continent's interior. Sergeant Macready approached with his characteristic measured pace, his graying hair and weathered face telling the story of decades of military service. "So, lad," he said, settling beside Thomas on the wooden firing step, "what will it be? The comfort of home, or another campaign season in His Majesty's service?" The question had haunted Thomas for weeks. His family's letters, filled with news of the tobacco harvest and local gossip, painted a picture of a world that seemed increasingly foreign to him. How could he explain to them what he had seen and done? How could he describe the transformation? From boy to soldier to leader of men? The war itself was entering a new phase. British forces under General Wolfe were preparing for a campaign against Quebec, while other columns moved against remaining French strongholds throughout North America. The tide had turned decisively in Britain's favor. But significant fighting remained before the conflict would be resolved. Thomas's squad had been reduced to 6 men through casualties and discharge, but those who remained had become closer than brothers. Private Morrison, no longer the frightened boy who had joined them at Fort Cumberland, had developed into a steady soldier and natural leader. The bonds forged in combat would endure regardless of their individual decisions about future service. The practical concerns of civilian life weighed heavily on Thomas's mind. His family's farm in Virginia required attention, and his father's letters hinted at health problems that made his return increasingly urgent. Yet the military had become his world, and he struggled to imagine himself behind a plow rather than carrying a musket. Colonel Washington had decided to resign his commission, choosing to return to his plantation at Mount Vernon rather than continue his military career. Thomas respected this decision, understanding that civilian life offered opportunities for advancement that military service could not match. Washington's example suggested that there was honor in knowing when to step away from war. The arrival of spring brought renewed military activity as British forces prepared for the campaign season. Thomas participated in training exercises with new recruits, passing on the hard-earned lessons of frontier warfare to the next generation of soldiers. Teaching others helped him process his own experiences and understand how much he had grown. Since his first days in the wilderness, according to historical records maintained in the Virginia State Archives, the Virginia Regiment was officially disbanded in November 1759, marking the end of one of the most effective colonial military units in the French and Indian War. The decision crystallized during a patrol along the Monongahela River, when Thomas's squad encountered a family of settlers heading west to claim land near the new fort. The man and his wife, accompanied by 3 young children, represented the future that Thomas and his comrades had fought to secure. Their courage in venturing into the wilderness reminded him of his own family's journey to Virginia decades earlier. Thomas made his choice on a quiet evening in April, as he sat by the fire writing letters to his family. The war had given him experiences and responsibilities he could never have imagined, but it had also taught him the value of home and family. He would complete his current enlistment and return to Virginia, carrying with him the lessons learned. In the crucible of conflict, the farewell ceremonies at Fort Pitt were both celebratory and melancholy. Thomas said goodbye to men who had shared the worst and best moments of his life, knowing that their paths might never cross again. Sergeant McCready, who had decided to remain in the Army, offered final words of wisdom that Thomas would carry with him always. The journey back to Virginia took Thomas along the same route he had traveled as a young recruit, but now he saw the landscape with different eyes. The wilderness that had once seemed threatening now appeared as a land of opportunity, tamed by the sacrifices of men like himself. The road that had been built with such effort was already showing signs of heavy use by merchants and settlers, as Thomas approached his family's farm. He reflected on the transformation that the war had wrought, not just in himself, but in the American colonies as a whole. The French and Indian War had created a generation of experienced soldiers and leaders who understood both the challenges and opportunities of the American frontier. The lessons learned in the wilderness would serve them well in the years to come. The reunion with his family was both joyful and difficult. Thomas found himself struggling to bridge the gap between his wartime experiences and civilian life, a challenge that would face countless veterans in the years ahead. Yet he also discovered that the leadership skills and resilience developed during his military service served him well in peacetime pursuits. Thomas Hartwell's war was over, but the American story was just beginning. The young man who had marched off to fight the French and Indians had returned as a seasoned veteran, ready to help build the society that his service had helped secure. The frontier he had helped defend would become the foundation for a new nation, and the lessons learned in the wilderness would shape the character of generations to come.